Welcome to the Regenerative Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have Edd Lees, who is one of the co-founders at Wildfarmed. Wildfarmed is supporting regenerative agriculture with its lineup of regenerative wheat flours that are used in retailers, restaurants, and bakeries across the United Kingdom, and powered by a network of 80 regenerative farmers. In this episode, we learn how the brand was started when a famous DJ traded in his turntables for a tractor, how they've grown the business through a branded B2B2C strategy, and their big plans for the first Wildfarmed CPG product launch in 2024. Edd is exactly what Wildfarmed aims to be across their entire business, full of life. We were honored to have him be our first international guest and kick off our international series as we start the new year. Wildfarmed has built something truly amazing, and it was super fun to get a behind-the-scenes look at all the critical pieces of their business, with the most important one being human connection. Let's dive in. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. Very excited today to have the first episode of our international series with Edd from Wildfarmed. So welcome, Edd.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Good to see you guys.
We're super stoked to have you. I already feel out of my depth because I'm typically like the retail distribution guy, and I know a decent amount about the U.S. market, and that's not going to be pertinent to today's conversation at all. So there's going to be a lot of learning.
Just bring your curiosity.
I'm here to learn. We're here to learn today. But, Edd, give us like a quick lay of the land for those who are unfamiliar with Wildfarmed, and, because most of our audience is U.S.-based, it's probably going to be most of us. What sort of products do you all produce? Where could people find you today if they were in the UK or wherever your products are sold?
Yeah. We produce regeneratively grown wheat, which is made into flour and a variety of other baked goods, pizza, pasta, biscuits. And we work with over 400 different customers or collaborators in the UK. And you would know you were consuming it because we've never done a single white label sale. So it's really more of a B2B2C model than just a pure B2B play.
Mm-hmm. Super interesting.
Yeah.
And we definitely want to dive into more of that and how you're communicating that story to the consumer, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So We'll pump the brakes.
Well, Kyle's reading my mind because I was going to tell everyone if you don't usually go to the website of the brand, go this time because the Wildfarmed website is elite. It tells the story really, really well. It tells kind of what y'all are doing in an awesome fashion. So definitely a plug for that. But Edd, we know that your business partner went from a DJ to a farmer, and that's how this thing got started. But tell us that story and how you got involved and how this whole thing came to be, man.
Yeah, actually, one of them was a Grammy-nominated DJ and musician. The other one was a television show host. He was on like primetime UK TV, and I worked in finance in a pretty well-paid but boring job. And those guys are both enormous. Like Andy's 6'9", George is 6'5", and I'm like to claim I'm 6 foot. And so that these are like these two kind of like famous, massive guys, and I look like a little random finance dwarf in the background. But yeah, how it started was Andy was in a band called Groove Armada. They were touring the world about 15 years ago. He was coming back from a gig one day, and he read an article about modern agriculture and all the problems that go with it. And at the end was this amazing bit of journalism that said, if you don't like the system, don't depend on it. And that's been that. Exactly. And that kick-started.
He took that pretty seriously.
Yeah, a series of actions that dragged a lot of people down a rabbit hole. And his first response to that was to start growing vegetables for himself at home, where he was living in southwest France at the time. And then, as he will tell it, the first time he saw the seed become a plant and the plant become food, like his entire world changed. He then, the vegetable patch became a polytunnel. The polytunnel then became a small stall at the local market in France. And then he took the appalling financial decision to sell his publishing rights for his music, which should have been his pension, and buy a farm in France, having never spent any time on a farm before.
Wow.
And I'll tell you this, the farm that the French will sell to a 6'9" English DJ is not the best farm in France.
Shocker.
It's arguably the worst farm in France. It was I think it had less than 0.5% organic matter. It was technically infertile, you could say. And then having never driven a tractor, never operated a grain silo, having never set up a fencing before, he embarked on a version of organic agriculture, and the results were predictable, if depressing. And all he got back was a series of plants that we don't want, which you can call weeds, because his soil had been his soil was in a situation where it was basically perfect. The fungal bacterial ratio was ideal for growing weeds and not for growing what he wanted to grow, crash crops.
Got it.
He then embarked upon a number of years of trying to fight mechanical warfare rather than chemical warfare against nature. And as you guys will know and have heard from all sorts of people you've had on this podcast, nature will win. And nature was winning hard. And Andy was taking himself to the brink of financial ruin. And he came across this book written a very long time ago by a guy called Albert Howard. We always say, if you only ever read one book about agriculture, it could be this. But you've had John Kemp on this podcast, so I'm not going to get into this stuff. And because he's the new Albert Howard. But the long and short of it is, in nature there exists a diversity of plants and animals at all time. And when you replace that diversity with any sort of mono-based system, you take a perfect solution and create a lot of problems. And so as a last roll of the dice, he then put his entire farm down to a diverse cover crop and bought a herd of cattle, having never had a cat or a dog before. And
go straight to cow, man. Who needs domestic?
Yes,
you know,
yeah, exactly. Go straight in. And within a year, his soil was looking visibly different. And he then became obsessed with how can I grow crops in this soil while doing the least damage and continually improving it? And Andy's a deeply academic guy. Before he was a DJ, he was a classical musician, a jazz musician. He went to Oxford University, got a top degree. Like, he's a very deeply academic guy. So he then became obsessed with who's got the best soil in the world. And that took him to the Amish community, and where he bought a bunch of equipment from these guys. And he was at one point farming with horse-drawn cart and GPS, which we think may have been a world first. And
hold on. I just need to pause real quick. The image of an English 6'9" DJ cruising up to an Amish farm, like, yo, like, let me buy this ancient plow or whatever they're using. Like, that's just like I need somebody to create a series about this particular transaction.
Yeah, exactly that. It was quite a humbling moment of my life as a finance guy trying to negotiate in that situation as well, which I realised was quite embarrassing, a humbling moment. But we can move on from that. And so he was doing that, and eventually, like, it all started to work. But to your point, this 6'9" English farmer, the French farmers used to stop at the side of the road and look at him and laugh. You know, and it was like, and there's a theme throughout this story of, like, you know, first they laugh at you, then they hate you, and then they want to join you, and I'm sure you guys can resonate with that a little bit. And we so he was doing this, and it's very well documented elsewhere, all his exact farm trials and tribulations. But he figured it out, is the long and short of it. How could I grow a cash crop in a healing soil, a continually healing soil? Okay, bingo. Then he went to sell the crop into the local grain dealer, which is just an extension of global commodity markets. And the numbers didn't add up. It just simply didn't add up. Hence why we're all here, right? And this was his moment of, like, I really am screwed. now that I don't, I've figured all this beautiful thing out, but all of these things that, we call externalities aren't paid for. They don't live on the spreadsheet. You guys know this. This was around the time I came in. George, our second partner, has an equally brilliant story, but I can't tell it for too long or we'll spend the whole time telling the origin story. George was a primetime TV show host and thinking, why is this not, I'm doing really well, but it doesn't feel great. And his father, who's a actor over here, well-known actor, said, like, game show host, it's not very serious in the general scheme of things, son. And then George went off on to find that he went off on what was meant to be a 6-month sabbatical. And about 3 years into his 6-month sabbatical, he wasn't really getting anywhere, and he thought, fuck it, I'll go to Ibiza and have a party, and he bumped into Andy there. And as I told you before, they're both very tall, and there's this thing called the rule of a tall guy at a party, and they all know each other, and because they're ahead above everyone else. And they said, and he was like expected the usual party patter. And Andy said, I just sold my publishing rights and I bought a farm. Okay. And so I've been following the story via George. George and I were good mates from way back. And when he came to this point where he couldn't sell it into the commodity market, I was like, this is because they have to be completely fungible items. I traded, I didn't trade commodities, but I traded equity derivatives and all sorts of different securities for a very long time. Said, if you want the items have to be fungible in markets. It's how markets work. If you've added value, you have to travel up the value chain. At this point, Andy was a little out of money and ideas. And I said, I helped him with George. We helped him set up a teeny tiny little bakery on his farm in an old farm building. We opened a tiny shop in town where he lived in this very small village. And in the second weekend that tiny shop was open, there was a queue for bread for the first time in this town since 1945 of mostly older people saying this is what bread used to taste like.
Wow.
Amazing.
This was the oh shit moment. We were just trying to help him out. We were just trying to help a good guy out. I had an easy life. I was getting paid loads of money, did whatever I wanted. It was all good. And so we said, okay, let's do a version of the bakery in London, or this whole farm to table network in London, because we know London better. It's a market we knew more. But I guess what's relevant is in this same time, Andy, as the bakery was up and running, we were selling to local schools and restaurants, and kids were coming to the farm and looking at the soil from one field. He used to do a thing and say, if you dig some soil from the neighbor's field and dig some soil from my field and see the worms, and if anyone can find a worm in the neighbor's field, they can go mad on the pain chocolat in the bakery. It's never got damaged. And all this was relevant. So how do you tell this like farm to table, like local community, short supply chain stories in a city where, a city like London or a city like, most of us are going to live in cities if we don't already. Like how do we find a way around that? And so, we talked about it for a long time. And in 2019, we decided, let's figure a way to scale this. And I got to say props to our sort of fourth co-founder, Adriana, because it often takes a woman to get 3 men organized. And she joined us in 2019. And we, in late 2019, and we, her and I made a deal after having had a drink one Saturday, if I'm perfectly honest, saying, let's quit our jobs and make a proper business out of this. And she went in Monday morning and quit her job. And I was like, whoa.
Wow.
But yeah, so then I just been made CEO of a finance business. I've done like my 20 years of getting to the top, and then 3 months in quit. and then 2020, we all know how that played out, but it was quite a good year for planning and building and thinking and being deliberate in what we were going to do. Right. And there were 4 of us then, and there are 45 of us now. And we're working with 80 farms across the UK and a handful in France still. Everyone's growing wheat under our set of I'm sure we'll get to it, but our third-party audited set of standards that we've drawn up within our community. It wasn't just us telling people what to do. And we got fully traceable supply chain selling to, let's say, 400 customers.
Dude, that's incredible. Unbelievable, man. Yeah.
I've got more questions that I want to ask. Anthony and I are fighting.
Just what was the time, the rough year where Andy bought the farm? So from that to 2019 was how long?
And So Andy would have bought it 2010, 2011, around then.
Yeah. So this
Oh, wow.
We started helping him around 2015, 2016. I think I
Yeah.
got involved. And
Okay.
then 2019, we kind of got started. 2020, we got going properly.
Yeah. And I'll let Kyle ask a question here in 1 second. I'm just going to tell a story that's an aside of the whole personality of this company and the people behind it is so evident. And it's evident by the fact that I'm just walking outside at Expo West last year and Ed just tackles me in the middle of Expo West. Never met the dude. He's just like, mate, what's going on? Love what you're doing. Like, let's talk, blah, blah. And so it's a full circle moment to finally get here. But yeah, man, I'm so happy that you did that and I'm happy that we're here. So I had to share that real quick.
I got to give Anthony shit. That was the worst British accent I've ever heard in my life. That recreation, that was horrible. But I've got 3 questions I want to ask. Sure. I'm famous for my multiple part questions. Number 1, Ed, like, why was this stimulating enough for you? This opportunity stimulating enough for you to leave the CEO position that you had worked so hard to achieve? That's 1. 2, why wheat? Of all the potential things you could be growing, why wheat? And then part 3, what does regenerative wheat look like on farm versus conventional wheat? Just to give our listeners like a nice kind of juxtaposition of like what those practices actually look like on the ground.
Yeah. Do you mind if I start with the last one first? Because it kind of ties to what Anthony just said.
It's your guest, man. You do you. You do whatever feels right.
Yeah.
You know, this is your party.
Yeah. So the organizing thought throughout Wildfarmed is that we do everything full of life. Like the fields are full of life. So everything we grow is at least, there's a series of things in our standards, but there's at least 2 crops in the same field at the same time, 2 different crops. So a wheat and a bean is typically one, and 1 flowering product, which brings a lot of the biodiversity to it. So there's always like a catch crop, and then we're getting the nitrogen from a bean as a sort of level 1 example, or a pea or something that will flower. And our fields are full of life. Our people are full of life. It's how we recruit. It's how we decide what products to list. It's how we decide how we show up. Every single time we're full of life. So that's our organizing thought. And that ties into when I was tackling him in that opposite district for the hell we were, Expo West. And why wheat? Okay. So again, it wasn't like we sat with our stroking our cats and came up with this. It was Andy took on the farm. It wasn't working. He wanted when I told you the story how he put his whole farm down to cover crops. The first version he was doing was just sowing directly into them. So he needed really tall crops that would grow above it. Like one of the things he came up with was a lawnmower, basically, an inter-row mower to help mow in between them. But in order to get the wheat sufficiently high above, he needed very tall varieties. And at that time, that took us down a road of like heritage wheats or heirloom wheats, as you'd call them, and that kind of stuff. So that was where we started, and then we developed a road, the value add from wheat into bakery. And again, it's worth saying, but probably not worth diving into too much now, that wheat it has a higher value in Europe than it does in the US. I don't mean like a dollar or cash value, but wheat's generally like the 3rd crop, isn't it, in the US, behind like soy and corn.
Corn and beans reasons. First.
Yeah. And what was the first question? I forgot now. Oh yeah,
why did you decide to leave?
Yeah, like why are any of us doing this, right? So there's a friend of our business who's a guy called Henry Dimbleby who he wrote the National Food Strategy for the
That's
UK.
Such a great name.
That's like the most UK name I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah. He is.
I could not laugh at that.
Henry is he's like he's like a statesman-like guy. And he talks about the modern food system, and he has this beautiful quote. I think we've done a social post about it, or we about to or something. He's written a book called Ravenous. It's an awesome book. But he says the way we eat is imperiling the way we eat, because it's this doom loop that we're stuck in of bad health and making soil worse and all these things. And when you start to see it, you can't unsee it. And, if you ask me, why have I started doing this thing? I started doing it, obviously naively, because no one would go into these things if you knew everything. And it's that naivety of doing things with a new lens. And you think about, probably get into this at some point, but farmers have generation after generation after generation of this is how it's done, and their colleges are telling them to do this, and their dad and their neighbor and their uncle, and you can't. If you have the weight of all that, it's extremely difficult to stand in a field when you've got probably 2 weeks in a year to determine your financial outcome and say, I'm going to do this completely differently. And what I've been told a good field looks like with just the crop and nothing else and totally clean. And these lunatics who don't know anything about farming are telling me I should have loads of other stuff in the same field at the same time. Find things like that to be like, incredibly inspiring, like taking people on a journey when you've seen things with fresh eyes.
I have super specific practice questions and then a couple other like higher level questions. When you talk about that diversity in field, are we talking like there's wheat here and then something over here? Are we talking actual like hardcore intercropping? Are we talking about row diversity? So that's question one. What does that actually look like? Question two are the standards public online? Like, can we direct people to view them, or do you have to be like a farmer and get them? You're nodding your head. Yes. Okay, cool. So that's an easy one. And then the third one is there like a technical assistance component to this where you guys are actually helping the farmers implement these practices instead of like just giving them the standards and being like, hey, good luck, buddy.
No, I'm really pleased you asked that, or I'd have definitely got told off by someone. It's because we've spent an enormous amount of time, money, resource on building a community. This is not a supplier relationship. Like that's one element of it. It's way, way deeper than that, because this isn't Andy as some like legend super farmer who's come up with this new way of farming. We haven't invented anything. We taken cues from all over the world. Like John Kemp, massive inspiration to us. The variety all over the world. Some really smart people. But in the UK, we've worked with a ton of people who we've helped shape these standards with. And yes, you can download them. I think you can download it. They're changing it. Basically, if you can't already, you're about to be able to download the whole sort of 48-page document. It might be you have to put your email address in so we know who has and who hasn't. But I believe you can. If not, you get the shorter one. You can ask for it, and you do get it. Anyone can get it, and everyone can get it. Your question about the specifics of it? The things that are easy to understand are in-field diversity at all time. So that could be, as you say, inter-row cropping, or in the same, like literal polycropping, multi-cropping, however you want to call it. Some people are doing extremely diverse rotations. It's a variety of different things. We want to make it relatively easy for people to make their own interpretations of. So it's diversity at all times, ground cover where possible, no use of anything that contains the word side, and a small amount of nutrition based only on need. So if you guys done much on SAP testing in the podcast before?
No, but I know John talks about it all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So it's essentially, in layman's terms, which we all are, it's like taking a blood test for a plant and saying, what does it actually need? Because a lot of times here, people are chucking a bunch of nitrogen on when the plant could be short of boron or manganese, which is making the nitrogen bioavailable to the plant. So a limited amount in small doses of nitrogen we do allow. It's not an organic product, certainly by UK standards. And integration of livestock once every 3 years at minimum. So like where possible, using animals over the land. So those are the basic tenets of it. It shows in a lot of different ways. The technical support is massive. It's a huge part of what we do. And again, it's collaborative and community-based. We would never have thought that something as simple as a WhatsApp group could have the impact that it's had.
Yeah.
Like we started a WhatsApp group with the farmers just to kind of keep people in touch and a bit of knowledge sharing. And have you seen this? And have you done that? And we've got a WhatsApp group with like 2,000 years of farming experience in it now. So that going back to that example of a farmer being standing in a field going, I'm seeing a bit of this and a bit of that. And, and the engagement within it is amazing. We've got all sorts of people who are not in our farming community trying to get in it now, but we have to be not trying to be us and them, but we have to be somewhat guarded for the, filtering for, forgivers and having people who are members of the community. But that technical support is, we give as part of being in the wild farm community, you get access to a bunch of agronomists on us, you get access to a bunch of SAP testing on us, And then the more informal stuff about meeting up, we do like regular meetups. We do a lot of farm visits. Again, a very highly relevant point that I didn't say before is when Andy moved back to the UK, which was 2020, he entered essentially like an X Factor competition for sustainable farmers that was set up by a body called the National Trust in the UK, which owns all those big stately.
Is Simon Cowell still the key judge for that
yeah, exactly.
contest?
There's always a Simon Cowell character. Yeah, exactly. And I wouldn't know. I can only tell you the farming one, and his name was Harry, obviously, and Harry or Jeffrey or something like that, and. Quentin. And they in England being so small and with such a history of a small number of families who all sort of know each other and farming communities pretty tight knit, we didn't know anyone. We were just three people, didn't have the background. And because it was COVID, Andy was living in France. He couldn't come to any in-person meetings. So he had to do everything on Zoom. And there were God knows how many people applied for this thing. Because what you won was a 25-year tenancy on this beautiful farm in the Cotswolds, which is a really nice part of the UK, like hour and a half out of London. Okay. And we didn't expect to win. And then Andy won, of course, and then didn't really tell his wife that he'd entered it because he didn't think he was going to win. And it was like, we've got two teenage kids. We're going back to the UK. His kids had never lived in the UK. They'd lived in France their whole lives. And
crazy.
And But us winning that, what's relevant about that is a national trust is it's a body with a lot of very high esteem in the UK. Like they don't just give this stuff up. It's been around for centuries, and or certainly a lot of the land in it has. And they're seen as a guardian of what's done right. And they were looking to attach themselves to a sustainable agriculture solution, and they chose Wildfarmed as the partner. And they're now rolling that out across, encouraging their other tenant farmers across their properties to do the same thing. I don't know how we got onto that, but it was super relevant point is farmers are typically highly practical people that learn by seeing. And coming to see a farm, I can sit here on a podcast as a guy who's never planted a seed in his life and say, you just put all these things in the field at the same time, and then you harvest them at the same time, and you separate them with a separator, and that's fine, off you go.
It's easy.
Okay, all right, mate. Yeah, all right, mate. And calm down. And then it's and then actually seeing, okay, so literally, the drill. So how does the drill go in, and what is the mower? And so, can you do it? Is it in 90 centimeter spacings, or is it on 150 centimeter spacings? And to your point before, is it one field, the next field? And all of these actual practical questions, having this sort of headquarters, it's been amazing for farmer learning. It's been amazing for customer engagement and supply chain engagement. And, one of the real advantages, we'll probably get onto this later, one of the real advantages of the UK or England specifically is it's a very densely populated, pretty small country. I think England, not the UK, but England, I've got a feeling is the 5th or 6th most densely populated country in the world. But you don't think about it because Scotland's quite big and Northern Ireland, what have you, spreads it out a bit in Wales. And it's why Amazon always did a lot of their testing here. Like I think we had Prime here maybe before the US. They do a lot of testing here. And it's been quite a good way of bringing a community, bringing people in and taking them out. And again, one of my favorite sayings that we use is like they arrive as passengers and leave as messengers.
Hell yeah.
That's beautiful.
That's really cool. I want to pivot and kind of go, and this is role reversal again for Anthony and I. Anthony's asking multiple questions. I'm pivoting to commercialization. I want to bring it back to the part of the story where you talked about, people had lined up for bread for the first time since 1945. And how, what happened after that aha moment? It was like, okay, this is real. We need to figure out how we scale this. Why did you choose the type of commercialization that you chose? How did you end up communicating the unique value proposition of the way that you were growing wheat to those consumers via these new B2B partners?
That's a great question. So what did we do? We wanted to start doing it in the UK because that's where we're based. It's where we know the market. And frankly, France is a horrible place to do business. But
the irony we talked about this before the podcast started.
We don't know. Yeah, we don't know, so we're going to take your word for it.
We talked about this before the podcast started. For us, they'd be like, if we lived on the West Coast, we'd be like, oh, you know what, man? Just like doing business with Kansas is terrible. Like geographically, that's essentially like kind of what you're saying, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
It's probably even closer than that.
No,
but sorry to interrupt.
yeah.
Continue on.
No, so we need to start growing grain in a way that, I mean, we weren't even called Wildfarmed at the time. We were the Real Food Fight at the time. We were like, how do we start growing grain along the way that Andy's grown? You know, we're going to get to this, I'm sure, but the key bit was we have to marry up the entire supply chain, which we've talked a bit about enabling farmers to make a transition rather than just expecting them to do everything, which is what's happened for the last however many years. We've been saying to farmers, okay, now you got to do it yield. Everything's about yield. You got to do it yield. And now all of a sudden we want to change the story. We can't just ask the farmers to do that after decades of telling them one thing. So it's crucially important to get the rest of the supply chain working. And actually the bit we're about to get into is we're going to make scalable change through human relationships. You know, like that's what brand is, right? We're going to get into brand, like the human relationship with food. The brand is the way to do it. And so we decided, okay, why did we decide to do it how we did it? A step at a time, pretty carefully and pretty conservatively, to be honest. How do we, which I know isn't the image we're giving so far, but we're to find some growers who are willing to grow in nature's eye, along ways that we're happy to sign off on, because we didn't have the standards at the time. We didn't have any sort of third-party audit at the time. And then find a processing partner, which again is something we should talk about. The difference between the UK and the US is significant. And then how do you start anything? We were like, right, we'll start with trying to sell flour to the artisan community and the Michelin star community, because they typically really care about provenance. There's a one of the things about flour is, even in a loaf of bread where it's the number one ingredient, is typically less than 10% of the cost of the retail cost of the item. So actually, I know when you go into things like pizza, it's even less. So you have the sort of the price elasticity, if you want to say, to really significantly charge a higher price without having to pass too much on to consumers, particularly if you can, like I say, get all members of the supply chain to be involved and say, you take a higher cash margin, but perhaps a slightly lower percentage margin on a more expensive product, and pass some on or all on to your customer, then we're all playing our part. And it was really that sort of nuance of selling flour that we thought we can get going like this. But as with anything, when you're asking people to pay more, like, okay, cool, I can afford to do that. But if I can charge more for my product, why am I paying more for the flour? And this was the bit where it's important to say we set up a B2B to C play, not just a B2C play, B2B play. We've never done a single white label sale. So everybody who's ever bought our flour has either put it, on store, called it a Wildfarmed product. They put something on socials, they put something on their website, and that kind of makes sense because they're paying more for it.
Yeah.
Like they're paying more for it. They should flex with doing that, and for us as a brand, that's important because you dot around. They see it, they don't really know what it means, but it all builds into what I call like the Kaiser Soze moment, which is at the end, it's like, oh fuck, I've seen that there, and I've seen it there, and I've seen it there, and the whole thing's like coming together, which is kind of what we're approaching in 2024.
So when you say that it's like slightly premium, sorry, AC, you go ahead.
We're on fire today. Just to recap, the two lessons that I took away from that, Ed, is using B2B and food service to still grow brand awareness by attaching the brand to the end products, even though you're just selling the main ingredient. And secondarily, getting those customers on board with doing that because they are paying you a premium wholesale price, and maybe the end product is increasing in price, but it's a substantially different difference for the wholesale increase than it is for the actual retail price increase to the consumer. Right.
Yeah, exactly that. And they can pass it on. It's up to them how they want to pass it on. And it's our job for our customers, the retailers, if you like, to make their customers want to engage with Wildfarmed, which is a big part of what we do. We end customer engagement, even though typically not always our customers.
So that's what I wanted to get to is what is the value proposition to those customers? Why do they want to buy Wild Farmed? Is it because it just simply tastes better? Is it because you're telling a story about the regeneration of the land and some of that like mitigation of climate change? Is it about the nutrient density of the products, which we haven't really touched on yet? Like, what does the UK market care about? And how do you bring people into that sort of top of funnel of, this is why you want to support Wild Farmed?
Yeah, it comes back to that thing of full of life, right? It's a message of life and hope. It's a message of agency. Like a lot of messaging around sustainability is incredibly negative. And actually we approach things with you take one look at our Instagram, it's lighthearted. Yeah, it's lighthearted. It's saying, and also empowering, like most people don't know that their greatest point of agency in the climate crisis and the health crisis is their food choices. And actually, if you want to get involved by seeing a cosign of that, then that's the way to do it. Like the original business model, that first iteration, and from the beginning, we'd always planned to be a consumer product. So we've spoken to consumers from the outset. But it was like an Intel Inside originally. Like you see this, if you see Wild Farm, like it's a good one. It's a cosign. That's why working with the top chefs in the country, like the artisan bakeries, these kind of places, it was an important way to start within we've always thought of it within concentric circles rather than like a graph. It's like who's in the middle of the concentric circle, who's in the next circle outside that, who's in the circle outside that. And we find that businesses usually can look 2 circles inside at most of them look 1 inside to who's influencing them. Like the big, the Walmarts of the world aren't looking that hard at what the artisan bakery in Santa Monica is doing. But it all sort of filters out that way. So we started with that community. We spoke to their customers because we know them. We know they like our story. We know they like our tone of voice. And it's how everything always starts. How does Supreme start? As a skate brand made for skaters and cool people. It's the same story.
And then from the cosign perspective, are your partners required to have some level of like your logo on the products or on the menus so that the consumers can make that recognition? Be like, oh yeah, this is Wild Farmed. Like I want to buy this.
Yeah, exactly. Like I say, we're somewhat flexible with it, but you have to say it somewhere. Like we don't do white label sales. Right. And again, that's a mentality thing. That's not just trying to build our brand. That's if you're going to pay significantly more for something that's affecting mass land transformation at scale, why on earth would you not want to like call it out to your customers?
Totally.
Yeah. It's also like a great business insight by accident because it doesn't sound like you designed it this way, but if you're a startup, outsource as much as you possibly can to someone that can do it better for a cheaper cost. And so if you do eventually want to become a consumer product, you're trying to flour in all these products that you're not making yourself. They're getting market feedback. You don't have to build all that infrastructure to actually manufacture it, to sell it. So, it's actually really, really amazing business. I think kind of by accident there. So that's really cool.
It's super CapEx light. The whole thing has always been CapEx light, so that we can work with best-in-class manufacturers all the time.
They must have had a good finance guy with that CapEx light model,
in all seriousness, I guess that's part of it is, Andy's, like I said, deeply academic guy. George is an incredible storyteller. And really, he was, before he was on TV, he was managing bands and, he was managing Lily Allen when she first started. He's really finding talent and understanding the, like what the sort of, hate the word zeitgeist, but like what the stylers are thinking and that, and to get to that tipping point. But yeah, I think that the blend of what all of us do, and we'll probably get onto it, is you talk about capital raising. It's like a huge theme for the next 10, 15 years for me is going to be like where you can align purpose and profit. Like that's it. Not just it has to be third sector or purpose, because nothing's ever going to scale. Charity is not scalable, and. I don't know. We're going to talk blended capital later, or I don't know when you want to do that.
Yeah, let's for sure talk about that. I want to talk about the commercial piece more as well. There's a burning question that I have on the production side, and I'm almost hesitant to say it because I got to ask a really long question here, but I think we should talk about it. And that's
Let's do it.
Directly from the website. It says, we work with a network of farmers, conventional, organic, large estates and family farms. What unites them is a desire to be supported and rewarded for embracing soil-focused farming. And That's a really interesting comment on the website to me, and what you've talked about with the farmer relationships, because over here, what I diagnose the regenerative movement as on the grain side is it's organic regenerative versus conventional regenerative. And the organic people think the conventional regenerative is not regenerative because they spray, and the conventional regenerative people think the organic people aren't regenerative because they till. And we are really over here, we have what I would call kind of a fissured movement, because we have these like little cliques and sects, and that's a big impediment to our progress, at least in Kyle and I's opinion, and I think an increasingly larger amount of people's opinion. And it seems like to me, you all have solved for that through greater alignment and almost using the brand to replace having to be conventional organic. It's both, and it's wild farmed. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, but that's exactly it, because there's I guess this is kind of a certification question, right? And like Andy, it's important to say Andy was an organic farmer from the beginning, and then we stepped out of organic 2 years ago. So only 2 years ago, and it was. So what's good about certification and organic? Okay, so how do we start this? We love the organic community. The CEO of the Soil Association, who's the organic committee here, is one of our growers, Helen Browning, amazing woman, and she's a big supporter of ours, and she's one of our growers, and we love those guys. But the simple fact of the matter is that organic as a movement hasn't transformed sufficient land, certainly in the UK, in the decades it's been around. And if you were to ask any right-minded person, do you want a plate of food with chemicals on or a plate of food without chemicals on at the same price, then they're going to do it. But it can't produce enough food in a system that people are willing to pay for. So we're looking for another way. But what it has got is trust and rigor. That's what certification brings. And it's like, how do you marry up trust and rigor with the fact that all the things we're learning, we keep talking about, John, there's a bunch of super smart people looking at soil. The tech is really getting better. So it's going to be fast moving and developing science. But how do you take a body that's got a load of trust and been around for decades, that takes a very long time to have heavy lockdown rules, and say, actually, we're going to be able to move with the science? Well, what we have is a set of standards that our community have come together to come up with. We can't just change them whenever we want, but if we combine trust and rigor with flexibility and transparency, that's one of the really big things I think that tech's brought us. It's the fact that we can have completely transparent supply chain. I think that enables the two. And as long as you know who's grown it and how they've grown it and what they've done to it, then you can sign up to if you want to spray or don't want to spray, or you want to do glyphosate, no-till, whatever you want. But I also, in that, think it's very difficult if you can't tell me who's grown it or how they grew it. I don't know how you can tell me that it's definitely regenerating anything.
I think my key takeaway from that is transparency allows for decentralization while maintaining a set of high integrity standards. And I'm now wrestling with, like, how do we implement that in the United States? And I don't know what the answer is, but that's my biggest takeaway. And I think that you all have hit the nail on the head. And what that allows for, to your point, is the potential to work with a far greater swath of land and to increase the potential positive outcome from the implementation of these practices. Right.
There you go.
So I think the model is fantastic. And it actually reminds me a lot of like what the Regen Coalition is trying to do, not necessarily from a single ingredient perspective, but from like a macro brand perspective.
There you go.
And it's really, really difficult. So kudos to you for, number one, you all, your team, and your community, for building this system and figuring out how to like communicate that effectively via this B2B model to consumers. It sounds really complicated, and it feels like it's going in the right direction.
But it's crucial. It's really important to say we haven't got it all figured out. Like, this is moving. I don't think we'll ever solve it. I was in some like mad old building in Scotland. I was saying, like, these are the kind of buildings that people spent their whole life building, and they didn't see it at the beginning. They didn't see it at the end. Like what Sagrada Familia is famous in Barcelona. And I'm like, I feel like that's what this is. Like, I'm not going to see this finish, neither are you two, But if we can be part of it and do our thing and move it along the way and just have that mentality of we can't solve this or own this. We have, again, I'll drop another one. We've got the guy in one of our advisors It's a guy called Professor John Crawford, who's one of the UK's or maybe Europe's leading soil scientists. And he has this great quote. He says, 10 years ago, I thought I understood 0.1% about soil. Now I think I understand 0.01% about soil. It's like there's so much to learn and so much to do. And the one thing we know is that conventional commodity markets have a very poor track record in affecting land use change, as do the existing certification models.
Two quotes I want to share after that quote. Number one is, I love this quote so much. It's, as the island of our knowledge grows, so too do the shores of our ignorance. So it's like the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know.
You don't know exactly that.
For sure.
And then another stat that's like blows my mind is like we know more about the composition of the dust on the moon than we do about our own soil. And just to think about like the allocation, the allocation of resources and what we've spent money on as a culture is like,
really good.
Why do we need to know what's in moon dust? You know, how many millions or billions of dollars have we spent on moon dust?
Wow.
You know, it's just silly.
Yeah, there you go. Wow, they're great.
Let's talk processing and then let's talk capital. I definitely want to make sure we talk about both of those. So, take us through the processing journey and what's that been like to set up, maybe the initial setup and what that looks like now, what that's going to look like in the future. Like what does that look like?
Yeah, again, this is so classic. Because so when we grew the grain in France, it was lower protein than absolute high numbers than the lot of mills we're used to. So they didn't want to mill it. So we bought our own mill and started milling it. And then and we realized that actually out and out protein levels, the protein's broken down. We're going to get way out of my comfort zone here, but I don't think you two know any better. is the protein in wheat? There's a difference between absolute high numbers and quality of protein. It's like the balance of the glutenin and the gliadin. And the best way that it was explained to me that we probably can all get on board with, it's the difference between the guy in the gym who's done loads of steroids and the weightlifter in the Olympics. One is like real strength and one is puffed up muscle Marys, as we call them. And I think conventional milling wheat is often the latter. A lot of things sprayed up for fake protein. So the processing was tricky in France. We had our own mill. So we came to the UK. We were like, right, we're going to sell grain, and everyone else can buy their own mills. And that was a pretty short bit of the business plan. Yeah. And so we there was in that summer of the COVID summer, we called every miller in the country to say, we had like 100 tons of wheat or something. We're like, will you mill it for us? Maybe even less than that. And we said, will you mill it for us? And everyone, we sort of fell between the real old school artisans who were like, it was more than they could do, or the real big industrial ones who just laughed at us and wouldn't do anything for us. And then we found one guy who was an amazing guy, and he and so we had a short list of one, and we all got in the car to try.
Good vendor evaluations. A robust list of one.
Tons of leverage for that negotiation too.
He was really nice. Yeah, exactly. And so we built a really good relationship with him. And as we've got bigger, we've sort of diversified a little bit our processing, and now we're at a scale now where a lot of people want to mill with us. And we're working with a partner pretty close to London who's got the newest, sort of biggest mill in the country, and not biggest, but the newest big industrial type mill. So again, we went through a period of everything's got to be stone ground. But again, what we're trying to do here is affect land use change at scale. That's what Wildfarmed is about, is scalable land use change. It's not about artisan bread. That's obviously a big part of our history, and we want to. Those guys are a massive part of our community, and we embrace them, and we love them, and we appreciate them and respect them. But unless they're going to sell bread to the millions of people in cities, then we're going to be waiting a long time. So the processing there was it was a slow process of doing it. On a similar story, we grew some grain in the US this year, harvest 2023. And where again, I was meant to be living in the US by now, building out Wildfarmed US. and I'm not. And in looking for processing partners in the US, I found a stat, and I think it goes. I don't want to get it wrong. Let me come back to you after the show, and you can put in the exact number. But I think it is 100 years ago. There were 50,000 mills in the US, maybe 10, and now there's like 150.
It's something crazy like that. Yeah, it's something insane. I've heard it before.
It's a wild number. So, but to stay on point, finding a milling partner was extremely important, a processing partner. And then it reads across with, bakery products that we're doing now. We're fortunate that our head of, we're going to get into the wrong bit there. You can edit that out. Okay. So milling partners in the US is a big focus for us. And I think we'll go through a similar story. We'll probably start with artisans, and then you scale up into larger players. Have you ever had Kevin from Cairn Spring on?
No, we have not. But I've heard him talk to Kuhn and others. Yeah.
So this is a cool story, and I can take some credit for this. So, and it might tie into the thing we're going to talk about later. So the challenge in the US around small scale processing is way higher than it is anywhere else. It exists in all developed countries, but in the US even more so, for understandable reasons. But again, it's this focus on yield, weight, size, scale. We focused on one thing for good reason. We came out of the Second World War, and globally there were 2 billion people, with a pretty clear route to 6 billion by the 70s or 80s. Yeah. And it was like, okay, there isn't enough food. So all of this chemical agriculture that we like to bash these days, it came out of a pretty noble intention of we need to feed the world, but it was all tested. It was all, what's he called, the guy who came up with it? I forgot his name now. And he came up with it in heavily degraded soils in Mexico, and it was, and it's okay. Well, it wasn't from very fertile soils, but
right. This is the Green Revolution.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And everything that's scaled alongside the scaling with it. But what I'll say is we need more people like Kevin from Cairn Spring and the Pacific Northwest. He had a relatively small milling setup that he's designed himself. He sells to a bunch of really high-profile bakeries across the US, and he was struggling to get the right capital to scale the thing until he looked at a blended capital model that was sponsored by a great friend of mine who I know you'll know, AC, called Dan Miller, who has a business called Stewart. Yeah, exactly. And I introduced Dan to Kevin, and I believe it maybe just closed recently. And this financing has come from the fact that pure numbers on a spreadsheet can't take account of this whole thing. We need to be finding ways, and we need measures, because it also can't be charity and too vague and too hippy-dippy either. Right. But we have to find ways of making the spreadsheet, take account for the externalities or internalizing these externalities. I've forgotten what the question was. I don't know if I answered it. But processing in the UK was a challenge. We got started. Yeah. I'm about to face the same challenge in the US, and it's bigger, like everything else.
Yeah, Stuart,
I want to talk about
doing amazing work. You're good, bro. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I want to talk about sort of the we alluded to this a little bit before the podcast, but there's the potential that there's going to be some branded product coming out in the near future for Wildfarmed. Before we touch on that, I want to call out, because I don't think we've talked much about the Green Revolution, and I think it's important to touch on this because a lot of those soil studies you were talking about started with degraded soil, and it really treated the ground as a substrate rather than a life-giving entity, right? So those studies look fantastic for the first 2, 3, 5 years because they're adding that synthetic nutrition, and the plants are booming and growing where they couldn't before. So it looked really good. So cool, let's do this everywhere, right? And to your point, with great intentions of feeding the world, without really realizing what the long-term arc was going to be for soil health, and then the chemical addiction to synthetic inputs that we now rely on today, which causes all sorts of illness and problems. So to me, it's really important to call that out and explain that regeneration is about not using the soil as a substrate, but really the life-giving matter to plants.
Yeah, that's right. Norman Borlaug, that was his name, and there happened to be quite a lot of nitrate knocking around after was it 1990, just before the First or Second World War. It's quite a lot of nitrate knocking around, and but I think that's the point: is when you focus on one thing only, whatever it is in life, there are unintended consequences. And we've just focused on yield for a very long time at the expense of everything else and built a highly complex system around it. And then the other things that you're talking about, Kyle, that we're trying to now bring into the equation are incredibly difficult to quantify and measure. Hence why all this sort of science-based advancement on this, again, AC and I think said this before, is if we could just get some of the dollars into regenerative agriculture that have gone into clean energy and electric cars, that's part
moon
of
dust.
The capital. Yeah, moon dust, exactly. Then we can start thinking about it, but it involves a level of humility of we don't know everything. We know that the levels are out. The chemical agriculture you're talking about, they get hooked on it. And then it's like, if you say, oh, I've got a headache, and you take a pill for your headache, and then that gives you a stomach ache, and you take another pill for the stomach ache, and then it makes you liver ache, and then you got a liver ache, and before you know it, like you were just trying to get rid of the headache, and you're taking 25 pills every day.
Yeah, and it reminds me, we're going way down a rabbit hole here, but that's like the wrong circle to be in. You talked a lot about these circles, right? These concentric circles, and that's the wrong circle to be in. Versus the alternative is the right circle.
The virtuous,
and I want to talk about optimizing for one thing, and this is something I think we've talked about on a few different episodes, but like what kind of scared me a while ago about the regenerative movement, and this is still probably relevant today, is like that carbon tunnel vision. Like, let's optimize to sequester as much carbon as we possibly can, which, don't get me wrong, like that's a great goal, but that's not the only thing that regenerative agriculture does. And if that's the only thing we prioritize, we're going to miss the boat on water cycles, biodiversity, and all sorts of other really, really critical and super important components of regeneration that we really need to focus on too. But as a culture, I think especially in the US, and you can correct me if I'm wrong if it's the case in the UK, but like we really want to optimize and solve for the one thing and just focus on that one thing. And that can't be what regeneration becomes.
You've literally touched upon my favorite topic of the moment here, which is we create, because exactly to your point, we should just cover all the land with eucalyptus trees if we're going to do that. Why are we even bothering trying to grow food if we're going to do that? And it's this whole nature versus food argument. And in the UK, you can get paid to go do nature on your land and rewild it or wild it, whatever you want to call it. And you can get paid a bit to go around the perimeter of your land and put some flowers in the field margin, but you can't get paid anything extra to do it in the field where the crop is growing. And that's a huge thing that we're working on. And then
so
this
backwards.
myopia, I'm definitely going to upset some of your listeners with this, but whatever. Like the carbon thing's important, and a lot of the schemes I see trying to sell and resell carbon remind me of the CDOs in 2006 in Florida property. Like it's all like, I'll be okay, just wrap it up. I don't see it. And I'm like, I don't really like anything to do with this. And the last thing I'll say on it that I think you probably won't want to edit out as much is the reason I want to know what's going on globally in this biodiversity thing is important. It's not just birds and butterflies and bees and it's so important. That is how the land will be able to continue to feed us. And an example that I give a lot to people is we're here in the UK and we're trying to do our thing, but this international collaboration about what everyone's doing is important. Before the 70s, there was no such thing as gap accounting. So if you wanted to try and do international M&A, good luck with that. It didn't really exist. And then the big 4 or 5 accountancy firms came up with that. This is roughly what general accounting, accepted accounting principles are. And all of a sudden, that facilitated this amazing moment of globalization and companies being able to operate in different spaces and the rest of it, because you kind of knew what you were buying. Otherwise, you didn't know what this statement was or that statement. And I think we're about to hit that with sustainability. I see all of the big firms, we get invited in to talk to them. They're just nicking out homework so they can sell it to big businesses. I'm kind of cool with that, to be honest, because if we try and sit there and own it ourselves, who's the hell's going to listen to me? It's going to be, they're going to walk into the big businesses and say, you have to get on board with doing this. And they started it with carbon. So it's good that it's the first thing that's down there. They're putting it on their, in their annual accounts, but it can't stop there, because that myopia will be exactly as you said at the beginning, Kyle. It will be the hacking of the system, which would be a huge missed opportunity.
Totally agree. Well, we've gone way down a weird rabbit hole. AC, you go ahead. I'm taking us in weird directions. No, it's okay. It's a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, it's all good. I think the carbon thing is really interesting because when you look at the small and the medium enterprises versus the large multinationals, the SMEs are really focused on nutrition. To me, they're focused on the sustainability piece, but they're winning. The ones that are winning with nutrition, with customers.
Yeah, makes sense,
right? And the multinationals are really focused on scope 3 reporting and supply chain resilience to really satisfy investors, not necessarily the end consumer that's buying the Cheerios or whatever the big mass-produced product is. And I think that's really the greatest opportunity. And I don't spend enough time in carbon markets to say, hey, here are the big problems. Here's how we fix them. Here's what I think is going to happen in the future. But I do think from a food company perspective, there's businesses being underwritten based on those markets, but we don't need to do that in this case. Like we can underwrite good business fundamentals on winning consumers with the fundamentals, right? And so that to me is very exciting. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it is very exciting. And Ed, I want to give you a chance to just talk about the capital stacking and the investment to date. And I'm sure we could talk about that for a whole hour. So I'm just going to let you take us where you want us to go. But, blended capital stacks in the U.S. context means different types of capital with different return expectations and different timelines. So first, let us know if that's what you mean when you use that phrase and what it means for the Wildfarm context.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I mean. And it isn't what we've done, but it is to the point we were saying before about the money in Moondust and the money in, we've been funded entirely by, people call it friends and family, but the families have been pretty useless. But we've just been funded by friends and followers, and we're at that point now where we're talking to institutional capital, and it's like getting aligned. Like family offices is a classic area where they've got that alignment of they're for profit, but they want a heavy purpose sort of filter in it as well. I think that's a really interesting investment theme for the next 10, 15 years. We've seen the zero rates, tech, VC, J-curve, crypto model of the sort of last 10, 15 years. I'm not saying it's run its course, but it cannot continue to grow in the manner in which it's grown. And it's so, it's sort of reached some level. And I think, it's
a specific tool for a specific context, right? And so let's just use it for that and not try and shove it into everything.
Exactly that. And when I went to RFSI in Denver, not last year, the year before, what I loved was, and this is where Americans are so damn good at this, like, let's get everyone in the room who needs to be in the room, and let's figure out who's going to go do what. And I found it so inspiring to hear from farmers, from politicians, from brand owners, from family offices, from pension funds, to all these different things saying, how do we do this? Like the US tax code is set up for this kind of thing. That I've forgotten the number that the charitable bit is. That it wouldn't be the same thing here. Okay, do you do a bit and it can be for profit, or is it? I've forgotten the term you have. But it's basically a business that's doing good in the world, but it's still a business. And then when you get to a certain size, you can then be
public benefit corporation.
PBC. There you go. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Like these things are the way it has to work. Over here, it's different. Like we're getting going, but a lot of the time, it's just been a lot of individuals. We're very fortunate with our network. We're a bit older than have I lost you guys?
No, I'm still with you.
Yeah. No, we've been fortunate with our network. We're a bit older than the average founders. And then we've got traction. So the fact that we've demonstrated traction, and a lot of regenerative business models don't really have a route to profitability. We do. And I think that's an important part of it. You have to go in there and say, right, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to grow it. You have to have more than one vertical. I think small brands just trying to go into grocery, they struggle to get sales high enough to be able to create the sort of gross margin they need to pay for the teams and all the stuff behind it that you need to be able to really compete and win. And we're fortunate that we've got the ingredients business, as you discussed. I haven't really talked about it much today, but we have a small bakery business in London, very London focused, and we serve B2B customers who said, I want to vote Wildfarm, but I don't make my own stuff. Can you make for us? And then, as you touched upon, next year we are going to be going live in nationwide grocery with fully Wildfarm branded products of our own, across nationwide stores. So, that we've got these three verticals, all of which can contribute to paying for the operational costs that you need.
That's a pretty big bombshell to drop here an hour into the interview that you guys are going national with your own CPG line. So I know a lot of that's still under wraps, Ed, but what can you share there?
Yeah, what's super exciting is we've been co-branded across a bunch of products so far, but this scalable change of land use is going to come by customers being able to say, I voted Wild Farm, by engaging with it. We've seen a ton of brands break through by doing something different in a very well-established, slightly dusty area of the supermarket. We can think Oatly. In the US, I love Liquid Death. I think it's an amazing story of where everyone's told the same story the same way since forever. I think you've got to come in, have a point of view, have a story to tell, and be at a price point that is higher than used to, but is still a thing that everyone can afford, and give people a reason to feel that they're buying a product, to demonstrate that it has to be higher quality, B, it's got to be good for health, as we've discussed. But I think also this thing about flexing, like virtue signaling, almost with the bread you buy in this case, but then all the other products that are going to come after. I guess the thing that's relevant is one of the nationwide retailers has really got on board with us as both a grower and then to really push. So they've joined our community as one of our smaller growers, but then to push us as a startup brand. I think is amazing that this is big business being a force for good, and I hope we're the first brand they've really done this with, and they really want to get into it as a regen thing. So hopefully it will be a huge success, not just for us but for them, and then that will encourage others, because Wild Farm's not the last word in this. We're just a member of a international community.
That's really cool.
And so what is the actual product going to look like? Where will people be able to find it, or is that still too under wraps to get that detail oriented?
No, it's not. No, it's going to be all in bakery. It's going to start with a couple of sliced loaves. Think Dave's Killer Bread, but regen, and for 2024.
Hell yeah!
And Wild Farmed. It's going to be the packaging you won't be able to miss. It's going to be full of life, like everything else. And then it's going to be some also some like sourdoughs and that kind of stuff, and baguettes and like in-store bakery. But then we've got a pretty long tail of new product development that comes after it. But it's kind of bakery focused at the moment.
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to tell you
nationwide, 350 stores.
Amazing. Number one, I almost want to make a trip to the UK just to buy your bread when it comes out, and check out all these different bakeries. And there could be a tour, which would be fantastic. You're mentioning the tail and like the potential innovation. Like my natural CPG grocery brain wants to dive into that to better understand how are you determining where you want to be? You mentioned looking at stale categories. Is it, and we don't have to get into the specifics of what you're going to manufacture, but I'd love to learn about the process. Like, are you looking at, everything that you can make with wheat? What categories are stale, like crackers, for example? Or is it all going to be within breads? You mentioned a lot of bakery focus. How are you all thinking about innovation in the future?
We started with sliced loaves. Why? Because they've got 98% household penetration in the UK. And then the tail, we have a team of salespeople going around every single bakery in the country all the time, seeing all the trends that are happening, not just in the UK, but in Europe and the US. So we have we have a lot of ideas coming from there. We have our own small bakery in London, which is a sort of test and learn NPD type center, so we can see if things work in a very small retail setting, but then a slightly bigger but still quite small B2B setting. And then if these things are landing, that's what's going to feed through to give us a sort of mass distribution, but co-manufactured by someone else according to our recipes.
Totally makes sense. And to touch on the comment earlier with the incumbents, I actually think it's a brilliant strategy. Find the stale old category with 99% household penetration, and how can you disrupt that market? Because I think it's ripe for disruption. Coming from somebody who sells broth, talk about a stale category, 10 years ago. So right. I think it's ripe for disruption, and there's tons of opportunity. And if you can communicate that value proposition to that consumer, to your point, the opportunity to make impact on land is massive. So I think it's a great move.
Right. Yeah. Good. Well, there you go. If I've got your sign off, that's good for me.
And you're underpinning that with a brand that isn't hyper premium, so it's not inaccessible like a lot of the regenerative products are today when they enter the market. And you've done all this legwork through the B2B customers to get affinity for the brand name and build, hopefully, this really nice funnel for trial that many new brands don't ever have, those two resources. So I think that's really powerful.
Yeah.
So good job, Ed. We're proud of you, man.
Yeah, thank you. You guys just do me a slide in my next pitch deck. That'd be great.
Done. Man, this has been so fun. Appreciate you spending some time with us, man. I know it's late in the afternoon, kind of early evening over there, but let's take it home with the last question that we ask everybody, which is, How do we get Regen Brands to have 50% market share by 2050?
How do we get? So we involve everybody in the supply chain. We even out that supply chain. We get the farmers, we get the businesses, and we get the customers to work together. And then if we create that virtuous circle that we've been talking about, it will just happen. Mm-hmm. But the challenge is getting to that critical mass. But yeah, the first bit.
Yeah. Human relationships. That's what you said earlier.
That's it.
That was like my big takeaway.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like we can talk about all the numbers on the spreadsheets. We can talk about all the accounts. We can talk about all the things, but what we can't really measure and what you've clearly showed throughout this whole show is like, there's this massive underpinning of human relationship that like undermines all of it in a really powerful way.
There you go. And that's right. The collective power of a group of individuals is never to be underestimated.
Spot on, man. I share a recent experience. I was recently at a holiday party, and we did a white elephant gift exchange, and I brought Alexander Family Farms, Regenerative Dairy in Crescent City, California. I brought their eggnog as my gift in the white elephant exchange, and everybody got to try some, and like the aha moment for everybody in that room to be like, this is the best eggnog I've ever had in my life. Oh my God, it's regeneratively farmed. What does that mean? That's the human relationship component here. And nobody's going to look at a spreadsheet, or maybe not nobody, but most people, shoppers, are going to look at a spreadsheet and be like, oh, I'm going to support this brand for these XYZ reasons. There's that emotional connection that's really going to move the needle. So I completely agree with what you're saying. And just really appreciate the time, man. Your perspective is super unique and interesting, just from the UK perspective, from the finance perspective. Amazing brand story. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and really appreciate the time.
Likewise. If you guys are anywhere near London, you hit me up. I'm going to fill you full of bread.
Ed, this was super fun, man. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, man.
No, it's been great. It's been great talking to you guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our Regen recaps on the website. Regen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Regen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the Regen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.